Hey guys, tonight we begin with something cold. Not emotionally cold, not royal marriage cold, I mean actually cold, Ice Age cold. The kind of cold where your breath freezes mid-complaint and even the mammoths are reconsidering their life choices. So go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe imagine you are wrapped in something warmer than a reindeer hide stitched together with a bone needle. Tonight, we're drifting back about 20,000 years, give or take a few millennia. Accuracy is important, but so is being cozy. We're going to talk about how cavemen, technically Upper Paleolithic humans, but cavemen feels friendlier, survived the last ice age. And they did survive, which is impressive, because the last ice age was not a mild inconvenience. It was not bring a jacket weather. It was glaciers the size of continents, winds that could sandblast your face off, and a landscape that looked like someone had turned the planet's thermostat to Arctic despair. And yet, here we are. So clearly, they figured something out. First, let's gently float into the world they inhabited. During the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, huge ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. In what is now the northern United States, you would not find highways or diners. You would find a wall of ice thousands of feet thick, which is less convenient for road trips. Sea levels were lower, shorelines were different. Entire land bridges existed where oceans now sit. The famous Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia and Alaska. No passport required, just stamina and a willingness to walk into a frozen unknown. Temperatures in many regions were dramatically colder than today. Even places that weren't buried under ice were often dry, windy, and harsh. Think tundra, think steppe, think, why did we leave Africa again? And yet, Homo sapiens were already widely spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They had left their African origins tens of thousands of years earlier. They were not clueless. They were adaptable, resourceful, occasionally reckless, but mostly adaptable. So how did they survive? Let's begin with clothing, because step one of surviving an ice age is not freezing immediately. Unlike their distant evolutionary cousins, humans are not especially furry. We are not woolly mammoths. We are not musk oxen. We are basically anxious primates with opinions, so clothing mattered. By the time of the last ice age, humans were already skilled at working hides. Archaeological evidence shows bone needles with eyes, actual sewing needles dating back at least 40,000 years. That means tailored garments, fitted garments, sleeves, probably even something suspiciously like pants, which is comforting. Animal skins were scraped, softened, and stitched together using sinew, animal tendon, as thread. Fur was often worn with the hair facing inward for insulation, or outward, depending on conditions. They layered, they experimented. They probably had strong opinions about which reindeer hide was superior. And unlike the stereotype of a single ragged loincloth, Ice Age humans likely wore multiple pieces: tunics, leggings, boots, mittens, and hoods. Some Arctic groups in later periods created extremely sophisticated cold weather gear, and while those come later in history, the ingenuity was already present in Ice Age populations. So they were dressed, not fashionably by modern standards, but functionally. And in a world where frostbite could casually remove your toes, function was everything. Now, let's drift towards shelter. Despite the term cavemen, not everyone lived in caves. Caves were useful, yes. They offered insulation from wind and relative temperature stability. They were also dark, damp, and occasionally already occupied by bears, so it was a mixed bag. Many Ice Age humans lived in temporary shelters. In parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of dwellings built from mammoth bones. Yes, mammoth bones. Large curved tusks and massive leg bones arranged in circular patterns, likely covered with hides to create insulated tents. Imagine building your house out of the remains of a creature that could flatten you without noticing.
it's practical, it's also mildly intimidating decor. These structures suggest planning, cooperation, engineering knowledge. They weren't randomly piling bones and hoping for the best. They understood wind direction, insulation, structural stability, because collapsing mammoth houses are not restful. Elsewhere, humans used wood, brush, and animal hides to construct shelters. In some regions, semi-subterranean homes were dug partially into the ground to reduce exposure to wind. The earth itself provided insulation.
And inside these shelters, there was fire. Ah, yes, fire, the original central heating system. Humans had mastered fire long before the last ice age, but in glacial conditions, fire wasn't just helpful, it was essential. It provided warmth, light, protection from predators, and a way to cook food. Cooking, by the way, was a survival advantage. It made food easier to digest and allowed more calories to be extracted. And when you're burning energy just trying to stay warm, calories are currency. They likely carried embers with them when moving camps, carefully preserving coals to avoid the labor of starting from scratch. Fire starting methods included friction techniques and striking stones like flint against iron-rich minerals. Not instant, not easy, but effective. And so, in the middle of vast frozen landscapes, small clusters of humans sat around fires, telling stories, repairing tools, probably complaining about the wind. Now let's wander gently into food, because surviving cold climates requires serious fuel. The Ice Age landscape supported large animals we now call megafauna: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, bison, reindeer. These were not subtle creatures. They were walking buffets with horns. Humans hunted them. Not recklessly, not alone with a pointy stick and optimism, but in coordinated groups. Hunting large game required planning, communication, and cooperation. It required knowledge of animal behavior and migration patterns. Spears were tipped with carefully shaped stone points. Later innovations included spear throwers or otlots, which increased force and distance. This allowed hunters to strike from farther away, which is generally wise when dealing with a multi-ton animal. Hunting megafauna was risky. Injuries happened, hunts failed, but a successful kill meant massive caloric reward. Meat could be eaten fresh, dried, or frozen. In an Ice Age climate, nature provided refrigeration. Fat was especially important. Animal fat is dense in calories. It fuels the body in cold conditions. Ice Age humans valued fatty cuts. They processed marrow from bones. They likely rendered fat for storage. They also hunted smaller animals, hares, birds, fish where available. They gathered plant foods when seasons allowed: roots, tubers, seeds, nuts. Even in glacial periods, ecosystems varied. Not everywhere was a white wasteland. And here's something quietly impressive. They tracked seasonal changes. They moved when necessary. They followed herds. They adapted their diet to local conditions. Which brings us to mobility. Ice Age humans were generally nomadic, not aimlessly wandering, but strategically moving. Mobility allowed them to respond to changing climates, migrating animals, and resource availability. If one region became too harsh, they could shift. If prey populations declined, they could move. This flexibility was survival. Now let's softly consider social structure. No one survived the Ice Age alone. This was not a one-person survival challenge. Humans lived in small bands, likely 20 to 50 individuals, extended families, cooperative groups. Within these groups, tasks were divided: hunting, gathering, tool making, childcare, shelter construction. Skills were shared.
Knowledge was passed down orally. Elders carried memory. Experience mattered. And here's the subtle brilliance. Cooperation allowed them to survive environments that would kill solitary individuals. They shared food. They cared for injured members. Archaeological evidence shows individuals with healed injuries that would have required group support. A broken leg in the tundra is not survivable without help, and yet some did survive, which suggests compassion, not just brute endurance, community. Let's drift a little closer to their minds. Ice Age humans were not mentally primitive. They created art. Stunning cave paintings in places like what we now call France and Spain depict animals with detail and movement. These works date back tens of thousands of years. Creating art in a cave during an ice age is not strictly necessary for survival, but it tells us something. They had symbolic thought, imagination, ritual, possibly spiritual beliefs. Art may have played a social role. It may have strengthened group identity. It may have been linked to hunting rituals. Or perhaps someone just looked at a cave wall and thought, this needs a bison. Either way, cognitive complexity was part of survival. Planning hunts, anticipating seasons, crafting tools, teaching children. This required advanced thinking. And speaking of children, Ice Age childhood was not easy. Infant mortality was likely high. Cold, disease, injury, all constant threats. But children also learned early. They observed, practiced skills, played in ways that mirrored adult tasks. Growing up fast was not optional. Now, let's gently acknowledge something else. Climate changed even within the Ice Age. There were fluctuations, warmer interludes, sudden cold snaps. The environment was not stable, and humans adjusted.
They altered tool styles, changed migration routes, modified shelter types. Genetic studies even suggest some populations shrank during particularly harsh phases, then expanded when conditions improved. It wasn't a smooth story of triumph. It was survival through adaptability. Eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Ice Age ended. Temperatures rose, glaciers retreated, sea levels climbed, ecosystems transformed, and humans were still there. Not because they were the biggest, not because they were the strongest, but because they were flexible, social, innovative, occasionally stubborn, but mostly adaptable. So when we picture cavemen during the last Ice Age, we shouldn't imagine shivering caricatures barely scraping by in a cave of despair. We should picture skilled hunters in layered furs, engineers of bone houses, careful keepers of fire, artists in flickering torchlight, parents teaching children how to read tracks in snow. They survived not through brute force alone, but through cooperation, intelligence, and a remarkable ability to adjust to a world that was, quite frankly, trying its best to freeze them out. And somehow they endured. So, as you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, comfortably distant from roaming mammoths and continental glaciers, just remember, your distant ancestors managed all of that without central heating, which is impressive and slightly humbling. We'll keep drifting through their world, slowly, calmly, because the Ice Age was long, and there's still plenty of frozen ground left to explore. Let's just ease back into that frozen world again. The wind is still moving across the steppe. The air still carries that sharp, metallic bite of deep winter. And somewhere out there, beyond the glow of a carefully guarded fire,
A herd of reindeer is shifting across the horizon. Ice Age survival was not one long emergency. It was routine. Cold, yes. Difficult, absolutely. But routine. Humans woke up. They tended the fire. They checked the sky. They looked at tracks in the snow and tried to decide what kind of day it would be. Because every day required decisions. One of the quiet advantages Ice Age humans had was their ability to read landscapes, not in a poetic way, in a practical way. Snow held information. A slight depression meant a passing animal. A broken crust meant something heavy had moved through recently. A scatter of droppings meant dinner was nearby, potentially. Tracking was not a side hobby, it was survival literacy. Hunters would move carefully, scanning the ground. They understood wind direction. Approaching prey from downwind was essential. Mammoths did not appreciate surprise visits. Reindeer were fast. Bison were moody. And no one wanted to be trampled just because someone misjudged a breeze. Hunts were strategic. Groups might funnel animals toward natural barriers, cliffs, riverbanks, narrow valleys. Coordination mattered. Timing mattered. There was no room for dramatic heroics, just patience and quiet communication. And when a hunt succeeded, the work was only beginning. Processing a large animal in freezing weather required efficiency. Meat had to be cut, divided, transported. Bones were cracked for marrow. Hides were carefully removed. Nothing was wasted. Tendons became thread. Bones became tools. Fat became fuel. Even stomach contents might be used. Ice Age pragmatism did not allow squeamishness. Now let's gently step away from the hunt and wander into the slower hours of camp life. Tool-making was constant. Stone tools were shaped with deliberate precision. Flint knapping required skill and patience. One wrong strike could ruin a carefully prepared core. But in skilled hands, stone became blades, scrapers, points. These were not crude rocks. Many Upper Paleolithic tools were elegant, thin, symmetrical, balanced. And tools evolved over time. Different regions developed distinct styles. Archaeologists today can identify cultural groups based on subtle variations in stonework, which is a quiet reminder that even in the Ice Age, humans had cultural identities. They were not just surviving, they were expressing preferences. Bone and antler tools were also common. Harpoons for fishing, owls for piercing hides, decorative objects carved with care. Some items served no obvious survival purpose at all, which is fascinating, because it means that even in harsh climates, humans invested time in beauty, in symbolism, in personal expression. Beads made from shells, teeth, or ivory have been found at Ice Age sites. Some were transported long distances, suggesting trade or extended social networks. Imagine that. In a frozen world, people were still exchanging goods, still forming alliances, still visiting neighboring groups. Social networks may have been one of the most powerful survival tools of all. If one band experienced scarcity, connections to another group could mean access to food, mates, or safer territory. Isolation was dangerous. Cooperation extended beyond immediate family. And speaking of family, let's quietly observe daily domestic life. Children would have played near camp, watched carefully, but allowed some freedom. Play was practice. Throwing small sticks mimicked spear use. Following tracks in mud built observation skills. Listening to stories reinforced group memory. Storytelling likely filled long winter nights. Around the fire, elders could recount migration routes, hunting grounds, dangerous areas, successful strategies. Oral tradition was the Ice Age library. No written manuals, just memory and repetition. And memory was powerful. They knew which valleys sheltered herds in spring, which rivers froze safely, which plants could be eaten, and which would make you regret everything. Seasonal awareness shaped their year. Spring might bring migrations and new plant growth. Summer offered longer days, more diverse food sources. Autumn required preparation, drying meat, reinforcing shelters. Winter demanded endurance and careful rationing. The rhythm of survival followed the rhythm of the land. Now let's drift toward health. Life expectancy in the Ice Age was not high by modern standards. Injuries could be fatal. Infections were dangerous. Childbirth was risky. But evidence shows that some individuals lived into what we would consider older age. Skeletal remains reveal healed fractures, dental wear, arthritis, signs of long lives shaped by physical labor. Care for the vulnerable existed. Individuals with disabilities have been found buried with care, suggesting they were supported by their communities. Survival was collective. Diet also influenced health. High-protein, high-fat diets supported energy needs, but food scarcity could lead to stress. Isotopic studies of bones show shifts in diet depending on environment. In colder northern regions, diets were heavily meat-based. In more temperate areas, plant foods contributed more significantly. Adaptation again. And now, gently, let's talk about climate unpredictability.
The last ice age was punctuated by abrupt climate events. Temperatures could shift within decades. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Rainfall patterns changed. For humans, this meant flexibility was constant. Campsites abandoned, routes altered, territories reconsidered. Some populations moved south during harsher phases, others adapted locally. Genetic evidence suggests population bottlenecks occurred, periods where human numbers shrank significantly. And yet, extinction did not happen. Instead, humans expanded into new territories, even into Siberia, even into Arctic environments. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas sometime during or near the end of the Ice Age. That journey alone required extraordinary resilience. Imagine walking across a vast, wind-swept land bridge, following herds into an unknown continent. No maps, no guarantees, just movement and hope. But movement had always been part of human survival strategy. Now, let's float briefly toward predators. Humans were not the only hunters. Cave lions, wolves, hyenas, saber-toothed cats in earlier periods. Competition was real. Fire likely deterred many predators. Group living offered safety. Weapons provided defense. Still, caution was necessary. Night would have carried a different weight. Beyond the firelight, eyes could be watching. Sounds could signal danger. And yet, humans endured those nights, repeatedly, calmly enough to continue sleeping in tents made of hide and bone. There is something quietly remarkable about that. Ice Age survival was not constant chaos. It was adaptation layered upon adaptation, innovation layered upon memory. They were anatomically modern humans. They laughed, they grieved,
They formed bonds. They made decisions with limited information and immense consequences. And slowly, over thousands of years, the glaciers began to retreat. The world warmed. Forests expanded. Megafauna populations shifted and in many cases declined or disappeared. Humans adjusted again. The Ice Age did not end with a dramatic curtain drop. It eased away, and humans, persistent as ever, moved into a new climatic chapter. So as we sit here, comfortably insulated from glacial winds, it's worth remembering that survival during the last Ice Age was not a miracle. It was skill. It was cooperation. It was patience in the cold. And perhaps just a little bit of stubbornness. They refused to freeze out of existence, which frankly is admirable. Now, let's keep drifting forward through that frozen landscape, because there are still more footprints in the snow to follow.
All right, let's drift back again. The fire is lower now, just steady embers. Someone gently nudges it with a stick. Sparks rise, hesitate, and disappear into the night air. The wind outside the shelter is steady, but not angry, just cold. Always cold. By this point in the Ice Age story, it's tempting to imagine survival as one long battle against frostbite, but in reality, it was something quieter, a continuous balancing act between energy spent and energy gained. Because staying warm is expensive. Your body burns calories simply to maintain temperature. In glacial conditions, that cost increases dramatically, which means Ice Age humans had to think constantly about efficiency, not in spreadsheets, but in instincts. Clothing had to conserve heat, shelters had to block wind, movement had to be purposeful. Wandering aimlessly across frozen plains was not romantic, it was dangerous. And yet, they moved a lot. Mobility was their insurance policy. If herds migrated, they followed. If fuel became scarce, they relocated. If a region grew too harsh, they adjusted their territory. This flexibility was perhaps their greatest advantage over other large Ice Age animals. A mammoth could not suddenly decide to reinvent its diet or migrate thousands of miles on a rumor. Humans could. Let's float gently toward fuel. Firewood was not always abundant in Ice Age landscapes. In colder, drier regions, trees were sparse, so humans improvised. They burned bone, specifically fatty bones from large animals. When dried properly, bone can burn surprisingly well. Imagine that. Your heating source might be the remains of last week's dinner. It sounds grim, but it was efficient. Fuel management would have been careful. Fires were controlled, not flamboyant. A roaring blaze wastes resources. A steady, contained flame preserves them. Inside shelters, smoke needed ventilation. Too much smoke and you have coughing and watery eyes. Too little ventilation and you lose heat. So placement of openings mattered. Shelter design mattered. Everything mattered. Let's shift slowly toward food storage. Cold climates offer one advantage: natural refrigeration. Meat could be frozen and stored outside or buried in snow. Drying meat created portable food supplies. Fat could be rendered and mixed with dried meat to create high-calorie combinations, something similar to what much later cultures would call pemmican. Portable calories were crucial during migrations. Ice Age humans likely planned ahead. A successful hunt in autumn meant preparation for winter scarcity. This wasn't guesswork, it was pattern recognition developed over generations. Now let's gently consider tools again, but this time weapons.
Projectile technology improved significantly during the Upper Paleolithic. The atlatl, or spear thrower, increased force and distance. It allowed hunters to strike safely from farther away, which is generally wise when facing something with tusks the size of canoe paddles. Later innovations near the end of the Ice Age would include early forms of bow technology in some regions. Precision mattered. Energy conservation mattered. A missed shot wasted effort, and effort was currency. Stone tools also became more specialized. Instead of one multi-purpose rock, there were blades designed for specific tasks, cutting meat, scraping hides, shaping wood. This level of specialization tells us something subtle but important. Survival was organized, planned, refined. Now let's drift toward the emotional side of survival. Ice Age life was physically demanding, but humans are not machines. They carried stress, loss, uncertainty. Archaeological burials suggest ritual behavior. Some individuals were buried with objects, tools, beads, even animal bones arranged deliberately. This hints at belief systems, at meaning beyond immediate survival. Belief can be stabilizing. In a world where winters were long and unpredictable, shared rituals may have offered psychological comfort. Stories, symbols, repeated traditions, these help humans cope with uncertainty. And uncertainty was constant. Climate shifts could happen within a lifetime. A region that supported herds for decades might suddenly become barren. Rivers could change course. Ice sheets could advance. Adaptation required mental resilience. Now let's quietly acknowledge something else. Not every group survived every shift. Genetic studies suggest that human populations contracted during especially harsh periods. Some groups disappeared entirely. Others merged. Survival was not guaranteed, but enough endured. And endurance required cooperation at a scale larger than a single camp.
Trade networks extended across surprising distances. Marine shells have been found far inland. Stone types appear in regions far from their geological source. This suggests exchange between groups separated by hundreds of miles. Imagine meeting another band on the tundra. Careful approach, assessing intentions, sharing goods, maybe arranging marriages to strengthen alliances. Social connection increased genetic diversity and reduced isolation. It strengthened survival odds. Now let's float gently toward adaptation of the human body itself. While biologically modern humans were already established, subtle evolutionary pressures continued. Populations in colder regions show evidence of adaptations like stockier builds over time, bodies that conserve heat more effectively. Cultural adaptation, however, was faster than biological evolution. Clothing improved more quickly than bone structure. Shelter design changed more quickly than metabolism. Culture was the real survival engine. And this is where Ice Age humans truly shine. Instead of evolving thick fur over thousands of generations, they made coats. Instead of waiting for claws, they crafted blades. Instead of growing stronger jaws, they cooked food. Innovation replaced anatomy. Now let's gently move toward the end of the Ice Age story again, but from a different angle. Around 12,900 years ago, a sudden cold snap known as the Younger Dryas interrupted warming trends. Temperatures dropped again in parts of the northern hemisphere. Ecosystems shifted rapidly. Humans did not collapse, they adjusted. Some groups intensified hunting of smaller game. Others broadened their plant gathering. Flexibility allowed them to weather even abrupt climatic reversals. And then, gradually, the deep freeze receded. Glaciers withdrew. Sea levels rose. Landscapes transformed into forests and wetlands. The megafauna, mammoths, giant deer, woolly rhinos declined and eventually vanished in many regions. Humans faced a new challenge, surviving without the enormous animals that had fueled their Ice Age existence. And once again, they adapted. They shifted toward smaller prey, toward fishing, toward more intensive plant use, eventually, in some regions, toward agriculture. But that's another long, calm story. For now, just sit with the image. Small bands of humans, wrapped in fur, standing beneath vast cold skies, fires glowing against endless ice, footprints pressed into snow that would melt thousands of years later. They were not superheroes. They were not primitive caricatures. They were patient problem solvers in a very large, very cold world. They survived through intelligence, through cooperation, through steady hands shaping stone beside flickering flames. And perhaps most importantly, through the simple, stubborn decision to wake up each morning and do it all again. So, as you rest there, warm and comfortable, think about that quiet resilience. The Ice Age tried its best, and humans, in their layered hides and bone-stitched boots, quietly refused to disappear. We'll let the fire burn low now. There's still more to wander through, but for the moment, just listen to the wind outside the shelter. It's cold, but inside it's warm enough. And that was enough.